topic today is hunger and food insecurity, a problem, I suppose, that, like the poor and poverty itself, has always been with us. There's some progress has been made, but there's still 800 million people, the UN estimates, in the world who are hungry. 6.3 million such households in the United States, and 1.7 million children in California who are said to experience hunger during the summer when food support programs through their schools are not available. So to help us address this problem and maybe introduce some potential solutions, it's a pleasure to welcome Sasha Abramsky. He truly is someone who barely needs an introduction. He's a writer, an author, and a continuing lecturer in the writing program at UC Davis. He's published articles in numerous outlets, including The Nation, Atlantic Monthly, Slate, Rolling Stone, and others. I had down in my notes he is the author of at least 5 books, because I was counting separately. It turns out that that's an undercount. It's actually 8, including The American Way of Poverty, which made the New York Times book list, American Furies, about the correctional system and the criminal justice system in the U.S., and most relevant perhaps to today's topic, The Hidden Scandal of American Hunger. Mr. Abramsky is a graduate of Oxford and Columbia Universities, and he is currently a resident of Midtown Sacramento. So it's a pleasure to welcome you and hope that your journey both over and back are safe and comfortable.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Richard, for the generous introduction, and to Brooke, to Kendra, and everyone else who made this possible today. And to all of you guys who could be doing anything on this lovely early afternoon, early autumn day and chose to come and hear me talk doom and gloom about hunger in America. It's also, in all seriousness, really good to be back here. I used to teach at the UC Center a number of years ago when the offices were smaller and the talking space not nearly as open as this. But it's really, really nice to be back here with the students and everyone else. What I'm going to do today is talk for about 40 minutes, trying to contextualize what American and Californian hunger is in 2017, what it is and what it isn't, and how people end up being hungry in a place as affluent as the United States of America. And then what we can do about it, some of the things should be being done, and some of the things that at the state or city levels, innovators are already starting to do. I'm going to talk, I would guess, about 35, 40 minutes, and then I'll open it up to questions. So if you have questions, I'm perfectly happy to take any and all of them until Richard waves for me to stop talking. The problem at hand, on its face, is fairly simple, and it's a numeric problem. Roughly 1 in 6 Americans on any given day qualify as being what is called food insecure. It doesn't mean that 1 in 6 Americans are starving. Doesn't mean that 1 in 6 Americans are necessarily malnourished. What it means is that on any given day, roughly 1 in 6 Americans has financial anxiety about where their next meal is going to come from. They don't know where on a regular basis the money exists for their food supplies to be stable. And they rely on either government assistance, food stamps, WIC, various other programs, or they rely on private charities. Or, in many instances, they literally tighten the belt. They miss meals. They eat 2 meals instead of 3, 1 hot meal a day instead of 2, or whatever it might be. Now, one of the other things that happens in America when people get into food insecurity is the kind of food they eat declines dramatically in quality. Because if you're hungry, and if you don't have much disposable income, you go for where you can get the cheap, quick calories. And cheap, quick calories come basically in 2 forms. They come in junk food and they come in fast food. And in both cases, what you get with junk food and fast food is lots of salt, lots of sugar, lots of very bad fats and cholesterols, and what you don't get is lots of fresh fruit, lots of fresh vegetables, and all the other stuff that we're told you got to eat if you want to have a healthy, balanced diet. Now, what is fascinating about this is the combination of abundance and shortage that coexist in modern America or in modern California. My friend Raj Patel, many of you may have read his book Stuffed and Starved, but Raj writes about this at length, that we have entered a period, not just in the United States, but globally, where one part of the population is absolutely sated. They have more than they can possibly need, more than they can possibly really want. And another part of the population has far too little, certainly far too little of the right kinds of food. And it's that juxtaposition of hyper-affluence on the one hand and despair, shortage on the other hand that I'm going to be talking about. Now, I'm a journalist, and one of the things that I've done over the last many, many years is focus on hunger. And I got really interested in this about 15 years ago, in the early part of the century, when the macroeconomy was booming. You just looked at the raw numbers. You looked at the stock market. You looked at housing costs. You looked at GDP growth. You looked at employment data. The big numbers look really good across the board. And yet, you could go to one town after another, or one hamlet after another, or one rural area after another, and it didn't take very much scratching, very much digging below the surface before you found real desperation. And the way that desperation was manifested was food lines. And you could see the food lines at food banks in big cities, and you could see them at church pantries and synagogue pantries and mosque pantries in small towns. And wherever you looked, you could see not just the long-term unemployed, not just the long-term homeless, but the working poor, people who had those 9-to-5 jobs, maybe had 2 jobs, but they couldn't pay all of their bills. And as a result, the first thing that tended to go was food stability. And so you'd see these people, young and old, single or families, you'd see these people lining up for free food. I remember about 10, 11 years ago, on a regular basis, I started doing these interviews. And I went up to Siskiyou County in Northern California, about 350 miles north of here. Very rural, remote area, with a lot of very, very low-paying employment. And I went to this tiny little food pantry run by an octogenarian couple. And I asked them, I said, look, why are you guys doing this? Why are you running this food pantry for your neighbors? You've worked all your life. You could be retired. You could be taking it easy. And the guy looked at me, and I'll never forget what he said. He said, we do it because for many of our neighbors, the month is longer than the paycheck. And it was an extraordinary way of describing it, that you have these people, friends, neighbors, ex-colleagues, and they're working full-time, but they know that come week 3 in the cycle, they're going to run out of food. Their pantries are going to get empty. Their fridges are going to get empty. And they're not going to have enough money to buy new food until the next paycheck, a week or 10 days down the road. And to fill in that gap, they had no choice but to fall back on the charity of their neighbors. Also remember, all the way across the country, I was in Philadelphia. And there's a very poor neighborhood called North Philly. And it suffers all kinds of problems, urban decay, a lot of drug addiction, a lot of homelessness. And I went early one morning, and it was a November morning. It was already pretty cold. And by this high school, this burnt-out wreck of a high school, there was this absolutely enormous food bank. And I got there a couple hours before the food bank was to open, and there was a line of a few hundred people already, and it stretched around the block. And I talked to this one woman called Vicente Delgado, and she was in her 60s, and she was suffering cancer. She had a brain tumor. And she was bundled up, and she was sitting on this fold-up metal chair outside the food bank. And I started talking with her, and it amazed me that somebody in her health situation was having to be there at 7 in the morning on this cold winter's day. And I said, why do you get here so early? And she said to me, if I'm not here at 7 o'clock, by the time I get to the front of the line when the food bank opens, they won't have any meat left. And it's the only meat I can eat each week is the free meat I get at the food bank. And again, that's an extraordinary realization. This is an old lady. She's sick. Everything is going wrong for her. And our system has broken down to the extent that she relies on free charity food in order to get basic nutrition, to get a little bit of meat each week. Now, I've been wrestling for years with why this happens. What are the causes of hunger in America? I know what it's not. We don't have crop failures that trigger famines. We don't have plagues of locusts that swoop in and eat all the grain. We do have droughts, but we've got such a sophisticated food growing system that even if a large part of the country is in drought, there's still plenty of basic foods being grown in other parts of the country. Same things for floods and all the other weather-related disasters. We haven't got a failed economy. We've got a functioning economic system. We might have a lunatic as president, but we still have a semi-functioning government. We don't have any of the traditional things that trigger famines. And yet we have roughly 50 million Americans who on any given day are food insecure. And a large part of my research and my reporting has been trying to figure out why. And it seems to me that it's woven into a much broader fabric of poverty in this country. And that you can't understand hunger here without understanding wage structures and the fact that so many people at the bottom of the economy are working jobs that don't pay the bills. And when they lose one job, they get a new job that tends to pay less than the old one. And it's tied in with the fact that even though at the moment there's low unemployment, not very long ago there was 10% unemployment. 7 or 8 years ago in the aftermath of the 2008 crash, we had double-digit unemployment. And that destroys savings, and it destroys financial calculations, and it creates ripple effects that last for years and sometimes for decades. And it's tied in with a health system that makes it all too easy for someone who, when they get sick, to slide into calamitous levels of debt. Or when their children get sick, to slide into calamitous levels of debt. It's tied in with a university education system that puts a huge premium on getting that degree, that makes you pay through the nose in order to get that degree. And so more and more people come out with unsustainable levels of debt. It's tied in with how we do or don't make investments in public housing or in affordable housing, especially in a high cost of living state like California, where an awful lot of people are spending a completely unsustainable proportion of their income on paying their monthly mortgage or their monthly rent, not leaving enough left over for all the other basic necessities of life. And it's tied in with the crumbling mental health infrastructure. And this is a perennial problem. That in the 60s and 70s, as a country, we made a decision we're going to release a lot of institutionalized mental illness into the community. Because everyone had seen or read about stories like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and we knew that those institutions were inhumane. So we released a lot of people into the community, and then we thought, great, we got all this money we're not spending on mental health. We didn't really invest it in community structures like we were supposed to. We did other things. We cut taxes. We built arenas. We did all kinds of things, but what we didn't do was adequately fund community mental health. And that, too, is tied in with poverty. Tied in with drug addiction, whether it be the crack addiction epidemic of the 1980s or whether it be today's opioid epidemics. But there's an awful lot of people who are heavily addicted to drugs. And that, too, ties into the story of poverty and hunger. And perhaps above all, it's tied into the choices we have made around criminal justice and around incarceration. That over the last 25, 30, 35 years, we've moved toward a model where we think it's normal to have 2.3 million people behind bars on any given day. And that incarceration system fragments families. It fractures communities. It destroys the job potential of those people who go into prison, and when they come out, makes it all but impossible for them to find housing, to access public assistance, find employment, and so on. And that, too, ties into the story of poverty, which ties into the broader story of hunger. Now, 50 years ago, 55 years ago, Michael Harrington wrote a book called The Other America. And it chronicled the stories of the invisible poor in a affluent society. Today, when it comes to hunger in particular, it's the same story. It is a huge epidemic. It's a crisis of insecurity that impacts that other America, and that we as a broader community tend to choose to ignore or to invisibilize. Now, hunger doesn't come about suddenly. It's not that a family or an individual is secure one day and eating well one day and absolutely unable to feed themselves the next day. Hunger creeps up on you. It happens in stages. It happens over time. And oftentimes it happens as a result, a predictable result, of a sequence of events in one's life. Events around loss of job or loss of number of hours worked. Around loss of benefits, in particular access to health care, in a system where if you don't have health care and you get sick, you get a lot of bills very, very quickly. It happens as the housing market gets more unpredictable. And usually what happens is people go through a number of permutations before they end up either applying for assistance or going to food banks and food pantries. About 10, 11 years ago, I wrote a book called Breadline USA, The Hidden Scandal of American Hunger and How to Fix It, or something like that. And it was to do with all these themes. And one of the things I wanted to do was try and experience that cycle myself. There was no way I could do it 100%. But I thought, all right, if I want to experience not just the physical feeling of hunger, but the psychology of hunger, I've got to put myself in that situation. So I did this 8-week experiment. And I limited myself to a certain amount of disposable income. I basically said, all right, let's start the process as if I'm working 40 hours a week for a minimum wage job. And I gave myself that as my disposable income. I said, all right, I'm paying this amount for my rent, and I sort of created a reasonable figure for a one-bedroom apartment. I'm paying this amount for insurance, this amount for gas and other utilities. What do I have left over for food? And I began constructing a food budget around that. Now, what you'll find is even if you're working full-time on a minimum wage job, certainly in a high-cost state like California, the equations don't balance. So the first thing that happens is you temporarily go into debt. You run up, a middle-class family might be insignificant, but to a working family is a lot of money on your credit card. You might run up $1,000 of credit card debt so that you can subsidize your spending on food in particular, because you can go to a supermarket, you can put it on credit card, you can hope to pay it off later. But the thing is, if you're part of the working poor, first of all, your access to credit is precarious. And second of all, your access to stable employment and stable working hours in a week is often precarious. If you work, let's say, for McDonald's, you can be working 30 or 40 hours one week, and the next week they can call you in and say, look, there's not enough work, you're down to 25, and you have no say in that. You just lose a certain amount of money. So after 2 weeks, I tightened the screws a little bit, made a couple assumptions. I start losing access to credit because I've maxed out my credit card. Number of hours I'm working goes down. Tighten the screws a bit. What does it do to my food budget? Well, immediately, that's the thing that goes, because I can't not pay my rent because I don't want to be on the streets. I can't not pay my utilities bill because I've got to have gas or I've got to have electricity. So I start skimping on food. I start halving certain things that I'll buy. Maybe I go down to 2 meals instead of 3. Tighten the screws a little bit more. I am driving an old car. I blow a tire. Perfectly reasonable accident. Happens to people all the time. I can't afford a new tire. I go to a second-hand store. But even a second-hand tire is going to cost me, let's say, $20 or $30. So I put down $20 or $30. I've maxed out my credit card at this point. I put down $20 or $30. It's insignificant as a middle-class person. But in the situation I'm in this artificial budget, that $30 is coming from one place and one place only, coming out of my food budget, because I don't have any other fat on the budget. So I cut down more and more. I'm not going out. Certainly not going to cafes, not doing any of the socializing that we do in public in America, because that costs money. Can't go to a cafe for a coffee, can't go to a bar for a beer, certainly can't go to a restaurant. I'm increasingly stuck. I'm sort of psychologically increasingly marginalized by that poverty and that hunger. Tighten the screws a little bit more. Maybe now, instead of just having my hours cut, maybe the boss calls me in and says, I'm sorry, there's no work for you next week. Now I'm completely on the margins. What you find is it takes about 4 or 5 permutations, and I did it over, every 2 weeks I tighten the screws. In reality, sometimes it happens every month or two, sometimes it happens more frequently. But I found it took about 4 or 5 permutations before I had no choice but to go to the food bank. No choice apart from malnutrition or hunger to go to the food bank. And I did. You can go to the food bank. You don't have to prove your poverty. I went, and I said, I need food. I got food, and I came back with a couple bags of food. And you can live on that for a while. You don't live on it very well, but you certainly, once you get to that point where you go to the food bank or you seek some kind of assistance, it will stop you dying of starvation. It will stop you getting literally malnourished. And also tell you it feels very strange. It does not feel good to go to that food bank and stand in line and fill in all these forms and do all the things you have to do to access food. Even though it was just an experiment, it felt humiliating. It felt personally debilitating. I did that experiment for 8 weeks. It formed a sort of large part of the story I was telling in that book. But I didn't have the full experience of somebody in long-term poverty and hunger. There was no way I could. I got as close as I could in the reporting, but there was no way I literally could live that experience. But I do know that those people who are in long-term poverty and are in long-term food insecurity, in addition to everything I've told you about, one of the other things they have to navigate is oftentimes deeply hostile, unsympathetic government bureaucracies, whether that's at the city level, county level, state level, or federal level. And that for various reasons, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, those bureaucracies tend to regard one part of their mission as exclusion, trying to trip up applicants, trying to find out why they're ineligible. Not always, again, but frequently you hear stories that the process itself is intimidating, that the process itself is humiliatory, that the process itself is designed to make you look to be a liar or a cheat or a con artist, to make you out to be someone there to milk the system. And that scares a lot of people away from those processes. So you have an awful lot of people who are in poverty and they are in hunger, and there are actually some programs in theory available to help them, and yet they're intimidated away from accessing those programs because of the way they are treated or the way they feel when they do try and navigate that bureaucracy. Now, the thing is, none of this is hermetically sealed. It's not just you can say, all right, so that person's hungry, big deal. Because hunger has all kinds of collateral effects. I was talking with the students earlier, and I was urging that people think holistically. I know I'm talking to a crowd of policy specialists, and people get really into their particular policy area, whether it's drug treatment, whether it's mental health services, whether it's environmental policy or water access. And the specialization's all well and good. We need it. We need it, especially in a political capital like Sacramento. But it is also important to sometimes get out of the bunker and realize that the issues that you are thinking about are actually connected to the issues that someone over here is thinking about. And those in turn are connected to the issues someone else over here is thinking about. I'll give you a few examples. When you send kids to school hungry, I've interviewed an awful lot of kids who tell me, look, I don't get hot meals when I go home. I don't get a hot dinner, and sometimes there's no food in the house for breakfast in the mornings, and certainly over the weekends we struggle with food. When you send that kid to school hungry, it's almost guaranteed that that kid is going to underperform academically. Because if you're hungry and you're 8 years old, all you're thinking about is that growling stomach. What you're not thinking about is how to do the math problem that you've just been asked. So you underperform. You get bad grades. You get held back academically. You might get suspended for disciplinary problems. And that comes with lifelong consequences. Because in this economy, which is somewhat of a meritocracy, you don't have the credentials, you don't have the degree, you're pretty much guaranteed to be getting lower paying jobs, lower opportunities. But it comes with long-term consequences. And that poverty is going to endure down the generations. So if you go to school hungry, you underperform, you end up in these dead-end jobs, et cetera, it's fairly likely you're going to pass that poverty on to your children, to their children, and so on. So it comes with a long-term ricochet effect. Another example of interconnection. if you send an awful lot of people to prison for an awful lot of low-end crimes, California isn't doing that so much anymore, but for a couple decades, we were doing that just as much as any other state in the nation and more than many states in the nation. If you send an awful lot of people to prison for petty burglaries, shoplifting, $5 drug charges, and so on, when they come out of prison, especially if they're drug-related convictions, they're going to find it almost impossible to access federal benefits. And that includes food assistance, and it certainly includes access to public housing. It includes, in some cases, access to grants for universities and education and so on. You're guaranteeing that a sizable part of that population is going to experience chronic food insecurity. And then that, in turn, is going to create feedback loops. Because if they're experiencing it, their families are going to be experiencing it. It's going to ricochet throughout the broader community, and it's going to have long-term impacts. Another example of interconnected policy problems is housing. I can't tell you the number of people I talked to during the mortgage crisis, 2007, 8, 9, 10, who were losing everything. Their house was upside down. They owed more on it than it was now worth. Many of them were being foreclosed on. They were being squeezed out of the housing market and into the rental market. They were doubling up. You'd have 4, 5, 6 families living in one house, or 4, 5, or 6 individuals living in a 2-bedroom apartment. They were making all sorts of compromises to try and stay with a roof over their heads. And increasingly, when I would have those conversations, one of the things that would come up again and again and again and again was hunger. That as they became more precarious in their housing situation, they also became more precarious in their food situation. For all the reasons I talked about earlier, you do anything you can to avoid losing your home because it's a really bad thing to be sleeping on the streets. And so you tighten the belt, you go without meals, you go without healthy foods, you make all kinds of compromises that are going to have a long-term health impact, but in the short term are basically the only thing you can think to do. Now, all of these are interconnected problems. They're part of this fine web that traps so many people in poverty. Tens of millions of Americans on any given day, many millions of Californians, depending how you measure it. I say depending how you measure it. By the government measure of poverty, California is sort of middle of the road. But if you factor in cost of living, which a number of think tanks and a number of economists who are trying to measure poverty more accurately now do, when you factor in cost of living, because of California's high housing cost in particular, by some measures, there are more economically insecure people as a percentage of California's population than there are in any other state in the country. And that's a huge, huge problem. Now, what fascinates me, and I suspect fascinates many people here because you're all policy wonks, what fascinates me is California's political story here. You know, I teach students at Davis, and they're all like 19, 20 years old. And for them, California has always been a paragon of liberalism or radicalism or progressivism. And I like it. It makes me feel good. They're all like, yeah, California is so liberal, and it makes me feel happy. Except I know it's not true. And so I say to them, well, you know, it's liberal right now, but you don't have to go back very far before California was pushing some of the toughest criminal justice policies in the country, laws like 3 strikes and you're out. You don't have to go back very far before California was pioneering the tax revolt through Proposition 13 and these other measures which decimated public services. And you don't have to go back very far before California was pioneering some of the toughest anti-undocumented immigrant legislation in the country, Prop 187, and this sort of tsunami of anti-immigrant sentiment in the late 80s, early 90s. And so, yeah, we're in this liberal moment. But we spent many, many years before we got to this liberal moment creating an infrastructure of inequality. We spent many, many years building up a prison system until we had, at one point, nearly 160,000 people behind bars. We spent many, many years underinvesting in affordable housing. So now we have these huge homeless encampments in every city in the state. We spent many, many years hampering our ability to raise taxes so that local and county and state government didn't have the infrastructure for mental health services, for drug treatment services, and all these other things that we know we need. We spent decades building up this infrastructure of inequality. So what is so interesting to me now is that we're in a different moment politically. We're rolling back the scale of our prison system, partly because the politics around crime and punishment have changed, partly because we're under court order to end overcrowding and end inadequate mental and physical health care treatments in prison. We're at this moment where it now is possible to raise taxes locally and to put bond measures on the ballot, and people vote yes for them if there are social services that come as a result. We now are at that moment where cities like Los Angeles can invest vast amounts of money in trying to build back up their affordable housing stock and trying to create public health infrastructure that works and trying to create public transit infrastructure that works. And all of that is really, really good. And it makes studying politics in California really interesting. And yet, too often, the scope of the need outpaces these newly progressive instincts that we have and that my students think we've always had. And so, even in this progressive moment, we see our housing crisis growing. You can see it here in Sacramento, the thousands of people who are homeless and wandering the streets and sleeping in alleyways and in parks. You can see it in the level of economic insecurity in poor suburbs or in the Central Valley or in the Inland Empire. And you could see it in the enduring crisis of food insecurity here, the presence of food deserts in the most fertile land in the country, the presence of food lines in the most fertile land in the country. Now, don't get me wrong, I do think that California and California's politicians, by and large, in 2017, are making a good faith effort to grapple with a lot of these manifestations of poverty. We saw it in recent years with the debate over reforming the maximum family grant, which was this incredibly punitive measure against women and kids on welfare, which essentially penalized children if the mother had more children while she was on welfare. California's moved away from that. We've seen it in California's attempts to create broader access to health care. We have the broadest access to health care of any large state in the country at this point, including attempts to extend access to health care to the undocumented population in this state of California. We see it in the attempts to expand help to community college students so that more people can afford to get that foothold in higher education. We see it in attempts to make it easier, less intimidatory, for families to enroll in CalFresh, in our food stamps program. We see it in attempts to reintegrate the thousands of people who are coming out of California's prisons into the job market. And we see it in the attempts at city levels first, and now at the state level, to increase California's minimum wage to more closely approximate what is called a living wage. We're moving up towards creating that $15 statewide minimum wage. And these are big reforms, and they're ongoing. A few weeks ago, we saw huge changes to the bail system, so that the bail system didn't punish poor families and poor defendants in the way that it does at the moment. There is this political momentum towards big picture reforms. And they're ongoing in the food area as much as in other areas. And I'm not going to give you a huge list. If you want the list, they're out there. But there are a number of bills that are now working on increasing access to food. SB 138, for example, which is going to make school districts use the Medi-Cal direct enrollment process to automatically enroll students in federal school meal programs. So what it's basically saying is, right, there's one bureaucracy already in place. If you're part of that bureaucracy, let's transfer it over. So rather than having to fill out all this other paperwork, let's just make it easier to enroll poor kids in these meals programs. It's going to affect a lot of kids for the better. We see it with SB 250. At the moment, we have this absurd situation where if a poor family is a couple dollars in debt, the school cafeteria can throw those kids off the lunch line. And SB 250 says, no, you can't. We're going to find another way to deal with this so that kids on that lunch line, just because their parents can't afford to pay $2 or $3, those kids are still going to eat a meal every day. We see it in SB 708, which is going to make it easier for ex-prisoners to access CalFresh. That's hugely important because so many ex-prisoners are ineligible at the moment for federal assistance. So we're looking for ways to do these carve-outs to get California benefits to people who are otherwise excluded. We see it in legislation that's being proposed to make it easier to help victims of droughts and other natural disasters, fires. I don't think we have hurricanes here, but whatever the natural disasters are, when people are impacted, California is going to make it easier for them to temporarily access food assistance. The list goes on. Now, all of this is good. All of this is necessary. None of it overnight, however, is going to solve either California's general poverty program or, more specifically, its food insecurity crisis. Because this took decades to get here. This took decades to dig the hole that we're currently in around poverty. And realistically, with the best will in the world, it will take many, many, many years to work through these problems and to deal with the systemic hunger and the systemic poverty that we see impacting so many Californians. But the optimistic note is, what it does mean, everything I've just been saying about what California is doing and is likely to do, what it does mean is that it's creating a political space, at least in this part of the country, for a sensible conversation about these profoundly important societal issues. It means that in a country that, by and large, seems to be retreating away from its commitments to protect the poor and to help the vulnerable, that is looking to scapegoat the poor rather than to provide them with services, California is standing out. That once again, California is behaving, as the 1930s, 1940s journalist Carrie McWilliams labeled it, as the great exception, that we are charting our own path. And it seems to me, and this is where I'm going to finish because I'm getting red flagged here, it seems to me that hunger has become our litmus test. That if we want to work out, will the various anti-poverty programs that California is discussing work, we have to understand whether or not they will impact our hungry population. We have to understand as well, will they impact our homeless population? Will they deliver more affordable and supportive housing? We have to understand whether or not our policies will ultimately be able to deliver better mental health services and addiction treatment services to people who need it. And we have to understand whether or not, at a state level, we will be able to channel down resources and expertise and energy and effort to the cities and the counties so that they can tackle their local housing and their local hunger crises. And this, to me, is not just a political challenge, not just a technocratic, policy wonk kind of an issue. At its core, the reason I care about this is a moral challenge. Because the question we need to ask is, will we, as Californians, provide a better and a more humane path to travel over the coming years? Will we be able to buck the national trends? And will we be able to use this vast clout that we have with the 6th largest economy in the world here in California? Will we be able to use California's vast economic and political and cultural muscle to create a regional alternative that other states will look to and will emulate and will become a part of? And in so doing, can we create a counter-narrative that will stand as a better alternative to the brutalist values that Trump seeks to impose on America as a whole? That's where I'm going to end it. Let's open it up to questions. Thank you very much.